Gentlemen, Chapter 12, the Judiciary. We are going to be looking at the judicial branch here in Chapter 12, and then we'll jump back to Chapter 11 and look at the interplay and the bureaucracy of our federal government. But I feel like it's best if we look at all three branches first so we understand their role independently, individually. We are going to be talking about the judicial branch, not just the Supreme Court. Obviously, there will be a lot more discussion of the Supreme Court, and we will delve into details of the Supreme Court explicitly, more so than the judicial branch in general. But this is going to be about the judicial branch, not just the Supreme Court. So the federal court system. Now, the federal court system, Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 tried to convince everyone who was afraid of the new government courts, don't be afraid. As he wrote, they were the least dangerous of the branches of government. According to him, they could take, quote, no active resolution whatever. You know, he argued they don't have the power of the sword like the president or the power of the purse like the Congress. They're just there, you know, they're there. We have to have them there, but they're not going to do a whole lot. You know, keep in mind that the Constitution does not give the right of judicial review, which is what we'll be talking about here in a few moments. Nowhere does the Constitution explicitly grant that power or authority to the federal court system or to the Supreme Court. Matter of fact, if you look at your Constitution, you will notice that Article 3, which is where the judicial branch is discussed, is the smallest of the branches in the Constitution. It looks like they took a lot of time doing the rest of the Constitution. You know, Article 1 is very lengthy and goes into great detail. Article 2 talking about the executive branch, several pages worth of information. And then Article 3 is 3 sections. I mean, honestly, I have seen longer essays written by students in American history talking about the Supreme Court than I've seen in the third article of the Constitution outlining the federal court system. So it was very poorly, I'm not going to say poorly written, it was very poorly defined. There was a whole lot of loopholes, and that's the thing, right, as we should have picked up by now in this course. Alexander Hamilton is telling you, oh, look at how small the courts are in this document. Look at how limited the courts are in this document. What he failed to mention is they weren't really limited. They just lacked clear definition, and there were some loopholes there that the courts could take advantage of, and they would. I and a lot of other folks believe Alexander Hamilton believed that judicial review should exist. It just wasn't written in there because they knew they would lose the ratification argument in some states if they did. Within only a few years, you know, the Supreme Court took Hamilton's, you know, stance and began determining what laws were and were not constitutional. You might remember Marbury v. Madison. I mean, it did not take very long. It was 1803 when the Supreme Court basically called dibs on the right of judicial review. It didn't take much longer for them to then stand up and okay the necessary and proper clause and the concept of implied powers. And by the middle of the 19th century, we had seen the Supreme Court declare a few federal laws unconstitutional, actually 2 if I remember correctly, and dozens of state laws. The courts had become an important instrument in policy making. And not in just legal resolution, but they were helping shape government policy and what is law, not just interpreting law, but deciding what is and is not law. I think an outstanding example of the growing role of the courts is a decision that I'm sure the court wishes they could forget, Dred Scott. The fact that in 1857, the Congress and a newly inaugurated president both were like, yeah, we're going to let the Supreme Court answer the burning question of slavery in the territories. You know, the fact that they basically took their hands off the wheel and were like, you got this, Supreme Court. That goes to show you the reinvented or the evolution of the role and importance of the federal courts. You know, they went from In the words of Alexander Hamilton, the least dangerous, no active resolution to, they're going to determine the question of Popsaw, free soil, future of the expansion of slavery, etc., right? Which have been ripping at our country for several decades at that point. Now, as the role, the influence, the prestige of the court grew, so did the desire to serve on the court. When the court was initially created, didn't do a whole lot, right? Up until really the tenure of John Marshall, the court was pretty limited in what it did and the role it played. So honestly, it was not the final destination for people career-wise. Of the 11 people that President Washington put on the Supreme Court, the average tenure was 7 years. Right? The average Supreme Court judge served for 7 years under President Washington. And not all of them died. A number of them retired. His first Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Jay. John Jay served as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1789 to 1795. He didn't die in 1795. The man retired. He stepped down from the court. He didn't want to keep serving on the Supreme Court. He didn't die until 1829. I mean, the guy lived for, 34 more years? Right? I mean, so it goes to show you that was not, the final goal for him. He was not content to spend the rest of his life as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But as the court grew and changed, after John Marshall had totally kind of reinvented the role of the federal courts and broadly expanded the influence of the federal courts and the federal government, well, then it became something where you want to stay there. President Jackson nominated 5 people to the Supreme Court, and they averaged 20 years on the court. So we go from 7 years on the court under President Washington to 4 years later under Jackson. People are serving 20 years on average, right? Because that is, and now it's life, right? No one resigns, except basically because of very old age and infirmity. But people stay there till death, right? Alito was there 30 some odd years, or close to 30 years. Excuse me. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she keeps hanging in there. She's very old. She's had a lot of health issues, but she's not stepping down. Right? People serve on the court until they're dead. It is the final goal because there is no higher role in law in our system these days. Right? Now, not only has the court grown in influence, and the courts, just courts in general, right? The federal courts. Not only have the federal courts grown in influence and prestige, but the fight over the federal courts has grown with it because politicians realize that the federal courts are like a new Congress, right? They are determining what is and is not law. They're okaying things. They're throwing certain things out. And so it has become a political battle. Between 1947 and 1985, almost every person nominated to the federal appellate court was confirmed. Not Supreme Court, federal appeals court. So for basically 4 decades, you had an almost 100% confirmation rate for the federal appeals court, right? But that has changed because of political polarization. People have realized the courts are yet another arena for Republican versus Democrats, and then they take the fight there. Great example. Okay, looking at the Supreme Court. 1986, Antonin Scalia, who was outspokenly conservative, was confirmed, 98-0. Ronald Reagan nominated Scalia. Scalia was confirmed 98-0. Okay? Just 1 year later, Robert Bork was nominated by Ronald Reagan. Bork, his nomination was denied, was rejected. Now, I don't like the fact your book does not insert. Robert Bork had some baggage from Nixon, Watergate. He wasn't part of Nixon's Watergate thing, but he basically followed orders from Richard Nixon to fire people. And yeah, so I think that one of the issues with Robert Bork is he had Nixon stink on him, and nobody wanted to vote for anybody who had anything to do with that, right? But anyhow, let's fast forward. 4 years later, in 1991, I think, Clarence Thomas was barely confirmed. A vote of 52-48. But also, Clarence Thomas, I don't like your book because your book fails to mention, Clarence Thomas was accused of sexually harassing Anita Hill. There were hearings. I remember it all over the television. Clarence Thomas was accused. It was kind of like Brett Kavanaugh, not the same. He was not accused of sexually assaulting or raping anyone, but he was accused of basically misconduct, sexual harassment. But still, the fact that there were these accusations that this guy had done this lewd, inappropriate, illegal act or acts, that made people, of course, sketchy on him. So, let's not look at Robert Bork and let's not look at Clarence Thomas as your normal run-of-the-mill person, per se, right? So, as I said, there are people who the statistics, if you don't know the background, sort of taint the understanding. They make it seem like it's more cantankerous than it might be. Right after Clarence Thomas, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in 1993, her vote was 96-3. Okay, so obviously there's something up with Clarence Thomas. Stephen Breyer, 1994, 87-9. John Roberts, 2005, 78-22. So you're seeing a little bit of reaction from Democrats towards the Republican nominee, but still, I would say 78-22 is still pretty solid, in one direction. But then you start to see, for example, Samuel Alito in 2006, 58-42. Barack Obama's nominees, Sonia Sotomayor in 2009 was 68-31. Elena Kagan in 2010 was 63-37. In both those cases, you had a number of Republicans voting against those nominees. The Senate made it known that they would not consider any nominee to replace the vacancy for the death of Judge Alito. And so there were no nominees in 2016 because the Senate just straight up said, we're going to wait for the election. We don't care what Barack Obama wants to do, which I guess that's their right. I don't really understand that concept. Like there's nothing in the Constitution that's like, if an election is X time away, you can do Y. They just kind of did it. So it's kind of a form of a filibuster. But eventually, Neil Gorsuch, who was nominated to take that vacancy in 2017, 54-45. And we are all fully aware of Mr. Brett Kavanaugh, 50-48. But again, there was a whole lot of baggage in investigating him. There was not that with Mr. Gorsuch, but 54-45. It has become a brutal chess match that we will talk about here in a moment. Now, going beyond the Supreme Court for a moment. Okay, look at the Federal Appeals Court, right? The confirmation rate, as I said, used to be ridiculously high. From 1945 until 1970, almost every single federal appellate court nominee was confirmed. But by 1995, you were down to about a 50% confirmation rate. By 2000, we're down to a 40% confirmation rate. Okay? Here you go. You want that in graphical form? Sure thing. Right? And so to the U.S. Appeals Court, not the Supreme Court, not the District Court, but the Appellate Court, confirmation rates, okay, in the 90s, upper 80s, and then as you can see, by the early 1990s, we're still near 80%, but then we drop into the 70, and so, and actually, these are the ones who, this is hard to explain because I said it was down to 50%. These are the ones who actually get their nomination through the process for the vote. Okay, there were a number of people that aren't included in this graphic. The president threw the name out there, and they got rejected for whatever reason before they ever got to a vote. Either they withdrew, or It became very clear that there was no point in going all the way, and their name was withdrawn by the president, whatever. But as you can see, we went from, Jimmy Carter, 92%. Okay, I know that people give Jimmy Carter a lot of flack for a lot of things, and I think some of it's justified. But the man got a 92% confirmation rate for the U.S. Court of Appeals. Ronald Reagan did the same, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, no, not so much. And then here you go. Look at the time. Look at the time from when you're nominated and you begin hearings to when you're finally confirmed. Under Bill Clinton, it was about a month. If you wanted to get to a district court position, it's about a month from when your name gets thrown out there to when your vote is held and you're confirmed. The appellate court, which obviously is a little bit of a bigger deal, you were still under 50 days. By the time you get to George W. Bush, you are up to almost 2 months. So we've almost doubled the amount of time it takes to get a person on the district court. And the appellate court had risen up to over 2 months, basically. And look at Barack Obama. What happened here? Right? Well, political polarization happened here. But the time frame to become a U.S. District Court judge went from 55 days to 140 days. To get on the U.S. Appeals Court takes basically half a year. Are you kidding me? We went from, 5, 6 weeks, half a year, right? Polarization. Okay, the number of days between a nominee's hearing and their confirmation has increased dramatically. Okay, and again, why? Because the federal judiciary is playing a more important role in making public policy, right? Who determined who won the presidential election in 2000? The courts did, right? Who decides whether abortion is legal or not? The courts do. Who decides? Congress can pass all the Obamacare they want. But when there's a case to determine if Obamacare is truly legal or not, who makes that call? The federal courts do. The people of Congress have realized that at the end of the day, the federal courts are actually the final hurdle. It's not getting it through Congress. It's getting it past the courts, because there will be a case, right? And they have come to realize that who is a federal judge is important, right? And what are their political leanings? Especially during periods of divided government, this becomes very clear. Your book mentioned during President Bill Clinton's first 2 years when he had unified government, basically the Democrats had everything, he had an 86% confirmation rate for his U.S. Court of Appeals nominees. During his second 2 years when he had divided government, when he had Republicans in the House led by Newt Gingrich, his confirmation rate dropped to 55%. Now, there have always been ways to prevent a judge from getting on a court. It's known as the blue slip, historically. Basically, by tradition, senators from home states have the right to file an objection against the person being put on the federal court, right? So let's say a person is being nominated to serve on either the district or appellate court that will affect Kentucky, right? By tradition, Mitch McConnell or Rand Paul have the prerogative to quietly file what is called a blue slip, where they make it known that they have an objection to this person. And the Senate Judiciary Committee will take that under their advisement, and usually they will quietly kill the nomination. Because the idea is we want to respect the fact that these senators need to get along with these judges, and if there's clear, some reason why they can't, let's find somebody else. It has become another weapon. It's like the filibuster. You do it because you can sometimes. You do it to twist the president's arm, right? To squeeze him. Hey, I'll support your nominee if I will take away my blue slip if you do this for me. It's become very, very politically charged and very politically loaded. Okay? Before we go on and talk about judicial review, I would like to just one more thing about this whole battle to get people on the court and confirmation hearings and how this has turned into a free-for-all. And this is where this is the chapter where I usually have Judge Thapar come in. Obviously, being a federal judge, he has a lot to say about this. And when it comes to this confirmation process, I feel like he does a very good job in explaining that the idea of hearings, right? The idea of having these hearings and these questions and all this stuff, look at the history of the Supreme Court. It was kind of his way of explaining it to students. And he basically said, look, you need to go back and look at when did this all start, right? When did they start doing these hearings? And it turns out that they started doing these hearings back when they nominated a guy by the name of Louis Brandeis to go to the court in 1916. Louis Brandeis was the first Jew to be nominated to be on the Supreme Court. And he said basically these hearings started out, it was an attempt by anti-Semites to prevent a Jew from getting on the Supreme Court. And so they started this whole concept of hearings and such. Now, Louis Brandeis got on the court, and you'll actually read about him and learn more about him a little later on in this chapter. But, he said, look at it. That's when it started. It started with Louis Brandeis. And really, outside of Louis Brandeis, a lot of people still got on the court, no problem, right? And then it's like every time that there's somebody that they want to stop from getting on the court, they suddenly fire off a whole bunch of we need to have hearings, and we need to this, and we need to that. We need to have all sorts of investigations and discussions. And as I've said in class, and as Judge Lepars said, let's take a moment and think about who gets nominated to be a federal judge, right? It's a person who 99-point-something% of the time has a law degree. Fun fact, you don't have to be a lawyer. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to, but one would assume you would be. You don't have to be, though, but all right. Most of these people are lawyers. They have law degrees. They have been lawyers for years. Some of them have been judges, prosecutors. They've been around the block, okay? They are not 25-year-olds looking for their first job out of law school. They are in their 40s. They've been practicing law for 2 decades, right? They have been around the block. And they obviously have got decent credentials. They didn't get their degree from some online sketchy university based out of some third world country. They went to Yale or Stanford or wherever, right? My point being, and it's something that, again, Judge Lepars talks about or references, these are qualified individuals. No one gets nominated to serve on the federal court on a whim, right? And so why are we having these major hearings? Are we curious? Do they know the law? Right? Are we checking to make sure they really are lawyers? Are we checking to make sure that they really have law degrees? Everyone knows they do. No one's questioning their ability to be a judge. What are we questioning? We're questioning their politics. Right? We're trying to find out if they are going to rule the way we want them to rule if a case were to come up. That's what we're doing. It's become political theater. And it totally violates the concept of the confirmation. The whole origin of confirmation, if you think about it, was to simply make sure that the president was selecting qualified individuals and was not loading the judicial branch with his friends and favorites. That the president was not using the judicial branch as a form of patronage and spoil system. That's really where it comes from. It wasn't about, let's make sure this guy's a judge. We know he's a judge. He's been a judge for 15 years. All we have to do is look at the court records, right? Why do we have to have a hearing? Why do we have to investigate, right? Why do we have to get testimony? And so, yeah, I don't really feel like this whole confirmation process is needed in the way that it is. It's become a political tool. It's not guaranteeing qualified people. It's basically trying to determine the politics. And it's something we'll talk more about, but I figured now was a good moment to talk about it some to help explain what is going on here. What is going on here is as Republicans and Democrats have become more divided, and it's become an us versus them, right? That has affected the courts. The courts are now us versus them, and it's about getting more of us on the court than them, right? And so that helps explain some of this phenomena. Now, as I have mentioned before, the power of judicial review, which is the power of the federal courts to declare laws of Congress or the states or acts of the executive branch to be void and not enforceable. Since 1789, the Supreme Court, your book says, has declared more than 160 federal laws to be unconstitutional. I have found where, as of 2014, that they had declared 176 federal acts unconstitutional. And I found another statistic that said it was up to like 187 by 2017. I think your issue here is, are they declaring like the whole thing or just like one part of it, whatever? Also, you've got, the word law versus federal act. I don't know. Here's an easy way to put it. We've had more than 160 times where the federal court system, the Supreme Court, has actually told Congress no. Let's just go with that. Okay? Now, that is a somewhat unique thing. In Britain, for example, Parliament is supreme to the courts. The United Kingdom does have a Supreme Court. They made one in 2005. Well, actually, it started actually functioning in 2009. The law that created it was passed in 2005. They didn't get it up and running until 2009. And it's much more limited. It does not have the actual power of judicial review that our court does. It cannot overturn legislation. It I guess can like voice its discontent. I don't know. About 60 nations do have something resembling our form of judicial review, but very few of them use it. Australia, Canada, Germany, India, you do find that there is a strong independent judicial system. But in countries like France, you have a lot of special councils that decide whether things are law or not. They really don't turn it to the courts. They turn it to special government councils. So judicial review is not a commonplace thing. We, by far, are the earliest people to exercise it or have it in a system, and other people have adopted it, but not everybody. Not all the democracies have. But judicial review, gentlemen, has become the primary weapon of the federal courts when it comes to the checks and balance power that they're supposed to have. We've talked about checks and balances. You learn about in American history. We learned about it in this class. The whole, here's what the Congress does, but here's how the president can prevent it. The ability of judicial review is basically the primary weapon of the court system in the checks and balances game, right? They can determine something the president or the Congress does to be unconstitutional and shoot it down. That is their big power. Now, very few people today would deny the courts have the right to do this. What some people will argue, right, or what some people will kind of look at is how they go about it. And that comes back to what we would call their interpretation, right? This goes back to the hearings, right? And this dovetails into some of the things I was discussing. There are two views for how you should interpret the Constitution. And a lot of this came to light when we were talking to Clarence Thomas to determine if he should get on the court. The first view is that judges should only judge. Basically, they should take the rules as they are stated and written or clearly implied by the Constitution and then rule on the situation based off what is written. We would call that strict constructionist or judicial restraint. Okay? Strict constructionist, judicial restraint. Same thing. Strict interpretation. Basically, word for word. It's not exactly word for word, but if I'm trying to simplify it for you, these people go, this is what the Constitution actually says, and that's what I have to go with, right? I am not supposed to try to interpret what they meant. I have to actually read what they said. All right? Now, other people argue that you need to find the underlying implications or ideas. Remember, the way the Constitution was written, sometimes the wording is vague or amorphous, and there's this concept that we've got to understand what they meant, what they wanted to say, or what they were thinking, what they were implying, right? That is called an activist approach, right? So these people are very limited, strict interpretation, and these people are like, well, they probably maybe kind of meant, this. Now, here's where we run into an issue, okay? This does not mean conservative versus liberal. I realize that when we say activist judges or activist anything, people assume liberal, right? And taking the Constitution at face value, that sounds like a very conservative approach. It doesn't necessarily mean that. You can be an activist, but be conservative. You can be a liberal, but be strict constructionist, right? There's nothing preventing it. For example, Hugo Black, a liberal justice, once voted to uphold a state law banning birth control because nothing in the Constitution prohibited birth control or birth control laws. Hugo Black was a liberal. Hugo Black was a big believer in personal freedom and all this other stuff, but he's like, look, I can't tell a state they can't do this because the Constitution doesn't tell a state they can't do this, so the state can do it. I don't agree with the law, but the law is not unconstitutional. Judges can be conservative and still think it's their duty to do what is best for public policy. Rufus Peckham, a conservative, voted to overturn a state law setting maximum hours of work because he believed the 14th Amendment guaranteed something called freedom of contract, even though those words are nowhere in the Constitution, right? So here you have a conservative who took an activist approach, and he created a concept that isn't actually written in the Constitution, but he's like, come on, they meant that. That theory, if you propose that to our founding fathers, they would have gone, oh yeah, that makes complete sense. We just didn't use those words. So don't just assume that every strict constructionist is a conservative and every activist or person who takes a broad brush, if you will, to the Constitution is a liberal. 70 years ago, activists were conservatives. 70 years ago, liberals were actually strict constructionists, right? If you think about it, activists, the conservatives, were basically trying to create things that weren't in the Constitution to make the government more conservative. Because think about it, 70 years ago was right after the New Deal and FDR and all that other stuff. And you've got all these judges desperately trying to find ways to end New Deal programs and federal programs and spending and rein in the government. So they were trying to find loopholes to justify rulings that would allow them to shoot down policies of Roosevelt, etc. Meanwhile, you've got liberals who are trying to support the policies of Truman and Roosevelt, etc., and the New Deal. And they're like, yeah, Constitution doesn't say anything about it, so I guess let the good times roll, right? And so, it has flip-flopped in recent decades. I'm not denying that. More often than not, you're strict constructionist or conservative, but it's not a guaranteed thing.